The lights in your home are flickering right now, and you probably think nothing of it. Maybe you glance up from your phone for half a second, notice the brief dimming of the overhead bulb, hear the refrigerator compressor stutter and restart, then return to scrolling through news about the latest economic downturn or political crisis or weather emergency that seems to dominate every feed. You dismiss it as a momentary glitch, a neighborhood transformer adjusting to load, perhaps a tree branch brushing a power line 3 streets over. Certainly nothing that warrants your full attention or any kind of action on your part. But what if I told you that this flicker, combined with 3 or 4 other subtle electrical anomalies you've noticed over the past 72 hours, represents the opening movement of a catastrophic sequence that will culminate in a total grid failure within the next 10 minutes, and that by the time you recognize the pattern for what it truly is, you will have already lost the narrow window of opportunity to protect your family, secure your resources, and activate the preparedness protocols that separates those who survive system collapse from those who become its victims. My name is Michael Williams. I spent 3 decades teaching economic history and systems theory at Brown University, and I've devoted the last 15 years of my life to understanding the intersection of infrastructure fragility, financial instability, and what I call applied historical survivalism, the practice of learning from past societal disruptions to prepare for future ones. I'm asking you now to stay with me through this entire presentation, because the information I'm about to share draws on classified Department of Energy assessments, historical blackout data, grid engineering studies, and economic modeling that most Americans never encounter. And I need you to understand not just the what but the why and the when of grid failure before you can grasp what those final 10 minutes actually look like and what you must do when they arrive. Take a moment right now and comment below where you're watching this from, your city and country, because I want to know how geographically distributed this knowledge is becoming and whether people in different regions are experiencing different warning patterns. The United States power grid is not a single entity, but rather 3 massive interconnected networks: the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and the Texas Interconnection, each operating as what engineers call a synchronous grid, where every generator, every transmission line, every substation must maintain precisely matched electrical frequency and voltage. When I explain this to my former students, I ask them to imagine a vast mechanical orchestra where tens of thousands of instruments must play in perfect time at exactly 60 cycles per second. And if even a handful of those instruments go out of tune or drop out of the performance, the entire symphony begins to destabilize, forcing automatic protective systems to disconnect large sections of the grid to prevent equipment damage, which in turn creates more instability, more disconnections, more stress on the remaining infrastructure until the whole magnificent fragile system collapses into silence and darkness. The grid was built primarily between 1945 and 1970, a period of massive post-war investment and industrial expansion when American engineering prowess and economic strength seemed limitless, when copper and steel and concrete flowed into thousands of substations and hundreds of thousands of miles of high-voltage transmission lines that formed the circulatory system of the most powerful economy on Earth. But that golden age of infrastructure investment ended decades ago, replaced by a long, slow decline marked by deferred maintenance, patchwork upgrades, regulatory fragmentation, and a fundamental mismatch between the grid's original design parameters and the demands we now place upon it. The Department of Energy released a comprehensive grid reliability assessment in July of this year, and while the bureaucratic language is carefully measured and politically neutral, the underlying message is stark. Increasing portions of the North American grid face elevated risk of insufficient capacity to meet demand during peak conditions, with particular vulnerability during extreme weather events, which are themselves becoming more frequent and more severe. What this means in plain language is that the safety margins that used to exist, the extra generating capacity, the redundant transmission pathways, the reserve equipment sitting ready to deploy, have been steadily eroded by a combination of factors that include retiring older coal and nuclear plants faster than replacement capacity comes online, surging electricity demand from data centers and industrial electrification, extreme heat waves that drive air conditioning load to unprecedented levels, while simultaneously reducing the efficiency of thermal power plants and transmission lines, and chronic underinvestment in transmission infrastructure that leaves the grid increasingly congested and unable to move power from where it's generated to where it's needed. The grid has become what financial analysts would call over-leveraged, operating with minimal margin for error, dependent on everything going right all the time. And we know from economic history and systems theory that complex, tightly coupled systems operating at maximum capacity are inherently unstable and prone to cascading failures when any single component experiences unexpected stress. I want you to understand the concept of cascading failure because it is absolutely central to recognizing those final 10 minutes and knowing what they mean. A cascade begins with a single initiating event, a transmission line sagging in extreme heat until it touches tree branches and shorts out, a substation transformer exploding because it's operating beyond its rated capacity, a cyberattack that confuses control systems and causes generators to trip offline. Even something as mundane as a construction crew accidentally cutting through an underground cable, and this initial failure immediately forces the grid to reroute power through alternative pathways. Automatic protective relays, operating in milliseconds, attempt to isolate the damaged section and redistribute the electrical load. But if the grid is already stressed and operating near capacity, those alternative pathways may not have sufficient margin to absorb the redirected power, which causes them to overload, which triggers their own protective systems, which forces yet another redistribution of load onto an ever-shrinking number of available lines and generators. The process accelerates exponentially, each failure happening faster than the last, creating what engineers call an unstable operating condition, where frequency and voltage swing wildly outside normal parameters, forcing more and more generators to automatically disconnect to protect their expensive equipment from damage, which removes even more capacity from the system, which accelerates the frequency decay, which triggers more disconnections in a vicious cycle that can collapse an entire regional grid in a matter of minutes once the critical threshold is crossed. We have historical precedent for exactly this kind of cascade, and the most instructive case study remains the Northeast blackout of August 14, 2003, when 50 million people across 8 American states and 2 Canadian provinces lost power in the largest blackout in North American history. The initial cause was almost absurdly mundane. 3 transmission lines in northern Ohio sagged into overgrown trees during a period of high demand and hot weather, shorting out and triggering automatic disconnection. Under normal circumstances, the grid would have easily compensated for the loss of 3 lines. But a software bug in the alarm system at First Energy's control center meant that operators were unaware of the failures and did not take corrective action, while simultaneously the grid was already operating under stress from high air conditioning, load and several power plants being offline for maintenance. As more Ohio lines failed and load shifted eastward, the cascade began in earnest. At 3:32 p.m. the Midwest grid lost stability. By 4:05 p.m. generators across the Northeast were tripping offline as frequency decayed. By 4:13 p.m. New York City went dark, and within 9 minutes of the cascade reaching critical mass, the lights were out from Michigan to Massachusetts, affecting power plants, water systems, transportation networks, communication infrastructure, and financial markets in a disruption that took days to fully restore and cost an estimated $6 billion in economic losses. The critical detail that most post-mortem analyzers emphasize is that there were hours of warning signs, voltage anomalies, line overloads, abnormal power flows visible to operators and embedded in the data streams that modern grids generate constantly. But these warnings were either not recognized, not acted upon, or masked by the very complexity of the system they were meant to protect. Texas experienced its own grid crisis in February of 2021 when an unprecedented polar vortex brought sub-freezing temperatures to a state whose electrical infrastructure was designed primarily for cooling rather than heating. And within 72 hours, more than 4.5 million customers lost power. Hundreds of people died from cold exposure and carbon monoxide poisoning, and the economic damage exceeded $100 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster in Texas history. The cascade in this case was driven not by transmission failures but by generation failures. Natural gas power plants couldn't get fuel because gas wells and pipelines had frozen. Wind turbines iced over and stopped turning. Even a nuclear reactor had to shut down because its cooling water supply froze. And as generating capacity plummeted while demand surged to winter peaks, grid operators were forced to implement rolling blackouts that in many cases became sustained blackouts lasting days. What made the Texas crisis particularly revealing was the economic dimension. The wholesale electricity market saw prices spike to $9,000 per megawatt-hour, bankrupting several retail electricity providers, while the state's political and regulatory leaders engaged in finger-pointing about whether winterization requirements and grid interconnection with neighboring states would have prevented the crisis, demonstrating how infrastructure failures immediately become economic and political failures that compound the human suffering and delay effective response. The vulnerabilities that led to these historical cascades have not been resolved, and in many respects they have intensified as the grid faces new pressures that its designers never anticipated. Cybersecurity experts and federal agencies have repeatedly warned that the control systems managing the grid, the supervisory control and data acquisition systems known as SCADA, the energy management systems that optimize power flow, the protective relays that trip circuits during faults, are increasingly targeted by sophisticated adversaries ranging from nation-state actors to domestic extremists, and a successful coordinated cyber attack on multiple substations or control centers could initiate cascading failures across vast regions of the country. Physical attacks on grid infrastructure have also increased, with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission documenting dozens of incidents involving gunfire, vandalism and sabotage directed at substations and transmission facilities. any one of which could serve as the initiating event for a broader cascade if it occurs at a moment when the grid is already stressed. The grid also faces unprecedented demand growth driven by the artificial intelligence boom and the associated construction of massive data centers that each consume as much power as a small city, by the electrification of transportation and heating as climate policy pushes away from fossil fuels, and by the simple fact of population growth and economic development in regions like the Sunbelt, where cooling demand is already extreme and getting worse with each passing year. Economic factors compound these technical vulnerabilities in ways that most Americans fail to appreciate because they don't see the connection between electricity prices, utility company finances, regulatory frameworks, and grid reliability. Investor-owned utilities, which serve the majority of American electricity customers, operate under a business model that prioritizes returns to shareholders and minimizes costs to remain competitive. In an era of low inflation and stagnant real wages, which means that expensive infrastructure upgrades are deferred unless absolutely necessary or unless regulators allow the costs to be passed directly to ratepayers, creating a political dynamic where elected officials face pressure to keep rates low. Even as the grid deteriorates, municipal and cooperative utilities face different pressures: limited access to capital, smaller rate bases over which to spread infrastructure costs, aging workforces with insufficient recruitment of younger engineers and line workers, but the net result is the same: chronic underinvestment in maintenance, upgrades, and redundancy. The financial crisis of 2008 and the subsequent decade of low interest rates allowed some utilities to refinance debt cheaply and invest in infrastructure, but the recent spike in interest rates has made borrowing expensive again, just as inflation has driven up the cost of copper, steel, transformers, and labor, creating what one industry analyst described to me as a perfect storm of deferred projects and mounting risk. Meanwhile, the transition toward renewable energy, while necessary for climate reasons, has introduced new grid stability challenges because wind and solar are variable and weather dependent, requiring massive investments in battery storage, transmission upgrades, and sophisticated grid management software that many regions simply have not deployed at the necessary scale, leaving operators to balance supply and demand with fewer of the large thermal power plants that traditionally provided what engineers call inertia and reactive power to stabilize grid frequency and voltage. The warning signs that appear in those final 10 minutes before a grid failure are visible to anyone who knows what to look for, but they require you to shift from passive consumption of electricity to active awareness of how power is behaving in your immediate environment. Voltage instability manifests as lights dimming and brightening in patterns that don't correlate with your own usage, as appliances cycling on and off unexpectedly, as motors running unevenly or making unusual sounds, as LED bulbs flickering even though LEDs don't normally flicker the way incandescent bulbs do because they lack a physical filament that responds to voltage fluctuations. Frequency instability, which you can't measure directly without specialized equipment, shows up indirectly in the behavior of sensitive electronics, routers and modems rebooting without explanation, uninterruptible power supplies beeping to signal that they're switching to battery backup even though power hasn't fully cut out, smart home devices dropping offline and reconnecting in waves as the FWLTAGE and frequency swing outside their tolerance ranges. Communication networks exhibit strange behavior during grid stress because cell towers, fiber nodes, and switching centers all depend on reliable power. And as the grid becomes unstable, these facilities may switch to battery backup or generators, creating gaps in coverage, slow data speeds, failed calls, and delayed text messages that people usually attribute to network congestion, but that may actually signal power infrastructure problems propagating through the telecommunications layer. Those patterns extend to public infrastructure in ways that create clear, observable signals if you're paying attention. Traffic lights at major intersections switching to flashing red mode simultaneously across multiple blocks. Not because of a single accident, but because the traffic management systems are losing stable power and defaulting to their fail-safe protocols. Water pressure in your faucets dropping noticeably as municipal pumping stations begin to stutter under voltage instability. Even the behavior of ATMs and gas station pumps glitching or rejecting cards before fully powering down. Emergency services provide another critical indicator. If you hear sirens increasing in frequency without obvious accidents or fires, or if 911 calls start getting busy signals or automated messages about high volume, that suggests dispatch centers are experiencing power anomalies that force them onto backup systems, which often have limited capacity and create bottlenecks just as the system needs them most. These aren't random annoyances. They're the physical manifestations of grid frequency decaying below 59.8 Hz or voltage, sagging below 95% of nominal. Conditions that grid operators monitor constantly but that reach the household level only in the final stages of instability, giving you that narrow 10-minute window to act before the protective relays trip en masse and the cascade becomes irreversible. Now picture this sequence unfolding in real time on a sweltering July evening in a mid-sized American city like Phoenix or Atlanta, where demand already pushes the grid to its limits at minute zero. A major transmission line in the rural generation area trips due to overheating, perhaps sagging into desert scrub, or overloaded by air conditioning load from a heat dome that has temperatures hovering at 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Conditions increasingly common as documented in recent Department of Energy warnings about surging grid demand from extreme weather. Control room operators see the initial alarm and attempt to reroute power, but the western interconnection is already congested, forcing more load onto parallel lines that were designed for 1960s peak demand, not today's data center and EV charging reality. By minute 2, frequency begins to dip as generators strain to maintain synchronization. Automatic load shedding kicks in at industrial customers, first think factories and data centers dropping offline, which shifts even more burden to residential feeders, and that's when you notice the first widespread flickering as household voltage swings wildly. Minute 4, cell towers in the affected zone switch to backup batteries, creating spotty service that people blame on their carrier, while traffic signals at key arterials go flashing red, stranding commuters and creating instant gridlock that will complicate evacuation if things worsen. Water pumping stations, which rely on electric motors without immediate generator backups in many municipalities, start to falter, pressure dropping system-wide so that high-rise buildings and distant suburbs feel it first as faucets sputter. At minute 6, the dominoes accelerate. A second substation overloads because the rerouted power exceeds its thermal limits. Protective relays open breakers in milliseconds, blacking out entire neighborhoods in rolling waves that look random but follow the grid's topology. Emergency dispatch centers now fielding thousands of calls on degraded systems while their own consoles flicker, forcing manual overrides that human operators can't execute fast enough under stress. By minute 8, generators across the region are tripping offline automatically, their governors unable to hold frequency as inertia from retired coal plants is no longer there to buffer swings, creating a feedback loop where lost generation causes deeper frequency decay, which trips more machines, and suddenly fuel pumps at gas stations fail mid-transaction. Card readers everywhere reject payments, and the first waves of panic hit supermarkets as people realize their digital wallets won't work. Without power, emergency response lags critically. Ambulances stuck in traffic without signals, fire trucks unable to charge radios or pumps reliably, police dispatch overwhelmed, all while the grid's under-frequency load-shedding scheme activates in stair-step fashion, prioritizing hospitals and military bases but leaving residential areas in unpredictable darkness. These 10 minutes aren't chaos from the start. They're a precise physics-driven unraveling where each failure feeds the next, and the household observer equipped with knowledge sees the pattern, emerging while everyone else dismisses it as just another outage. But here's where the story shifts dramatically. The Tenku twist that elevates grid failure from a technical engineering problem to a full-spectrum, economic and social cataclysm, because America's interlocking systems of money, supply, and human behavior have become so tightly coupled to continuous electricity that even a regional blackout lasting hours, let alone days, triggers immediate financial implosion and societal breakdown. Consider the economy first. The U.S. runs on just-in-time inventory where supermarkets hold 3 days' worth of perishables, gas stations 3 to 5 days' fuel, assuming deliveries, and pharmacies, a fragile chain of refrigerated drugs and daily restocks, all dependent on electronic payments. Diesel-powered trucks navigating signal-free roads, and data centers processing transactions. When the grid fails, card networks go down instantly because they require data center power. ATMs seize up, digital banking apps fail without cell service or server access, forcing a sudden return to cash, which most Americans carry minimally amid decades of debit card normalization and small bills at that, since change-making requires electricity. Wholesale fuel markets, already strained by inflation and geopolitical tensions, see stations unable to pump or pay suppliers electronically, creating shortages within hours as truckers can't refuel or navigate without GPS and traffic management. A scenario modeled in federal continuity of government exercises that predict widespread fuel rationing after 48 hours of major outage. Financial markets amplify the shock. Stock exchanges halt trading if power or data feeds fail. But more insidiously, clearinghouses and settlement systems that process trillions daily rely on uninterruptible power whose batteries last minutes, not days, potentially freezing the plumbing of modern finance and causing a liquidity crisis, reminiscent of 2008 but accelerated by digital dependency. Inflation, already eroding household savings with 24% cumulative increase since 2020, leaves no buffer for price spikes in generators, batteries, or barter goods, while corporate debt now at record levels with many mid-sized firms leveraged to service interest payments means bankruptcies cascade as operations halt without power for refrigeration, climate control, or assembly lines. Social pressures compound this. Political polarization documented in Pew Research studies shows declining trust in institutions, meaning rumors of cyber or sabotage spread unchecked via battery-powered hotspots, fueling hoarding and conflict over the last generator fuel or pharmacy insulin. While urban-rural divides exacerbate response delays as National Guard deployments prioritize population centers. In this future strain, the grid's fall unmasks our debt-dependent economy as a house of cards, where economic fragility turns technical failure into mass privation faster than any historical precedent. If you're finding this breakdown eye-opening and urgent for your family's future, hit that like button right now, subscribe for more deep dives into preparedness and resilience, turn on the notification bell so you never miss these warnings, and drop a comment below telling me your city and country, because knowing where viewers are tuning in from across America and the world helps me tailor these histories to your local risks. The survivor's mindset's what I teach my students as historical stewardship reframes these vulnerabilities not as inevitable doom but as opportunities for deliberate action rooted in America's founding virtues of self-reliance, community reciprocity, and prudent foresight, values forged in frontier homesteads, depression scrapes, and wartime rationing that sustained families through systemic failures. Prepared Americans don't wait for FEMA alerts. They map local substations using public utility data, stock water at 1 gallon per person per day for 14 minimum using food-grade barrels and gravity filters, maintain shelf-stable calories from rice, beans, canned meats, and hardtack-style bakes that store indefinitely, and rotate medications with 6-month buffers informed by personal health histories. Communication plans sent to battery or hand-crank radios tuned to NOAA frequencies for official updates. Faraday bags for sparing key phones and radios from EMP-like surges, though modern threats differ, and neighborhood networks where one household covers generator power, another water purification via Berkey systems or boiling, a third medical skills drawing from traditional remedies like willowbark aspirin analogs for pain, plantain poultices for wounds, or honey garlic syrups for respiratory stress when pharmacies empty knowledge from 18th century leechcraft manuals that complements modern antibiotics without replacing them. Evacuation routes avoid bridges and lowlands prone to flood or gridlock, favor secondary roads scouted in advance, with go bags pre-packed containing cash and 20s and 1s, laminated documents like deeds and passports, multi-tools, fire starters, and wool blankets that retain warmth, even damp, reflecting Civil War soldiers' proven layering over synthetics that fail wet. This mindset cultivates calm through daily drills, 10-minute family huddles, practicing light deployment with LED headlamps powered by AI rechargeables, role assignments where children handle water collection via camp showers, adults secure perimeter with door bars and noise discipline, elders manage low-effort tasks like document safeguarding in waterproof vaults. Financial preparedness mirrors this, diversified holdings in physical silver coins for barter post-dollar disruption, home solar kits with inverters for critical loads like fridge incomes, garden plots yielding potatoes and greens for caloric density, skills like basic welding or engine repair traded in community exchanges modeled on Amish mutual aid that weathered 20th century blackouts intact. In those literal last 10 minutes when flickers become rhythmic, voltage or multimeter confirms at 90 volts nominal 110, and regional reports via ham radio confirm overloads. Action compresses into decisive steps that leverage preparation into survival. First, fill every vessel bathtubs to the brim if pipes hold pressure. Pots and bottles from taps before pumps, fail yielding 50 gallons minimum for flushing. Cooking, rationing at half-gallon daily per adult. Unplug all non-essentials to prevent surge damage when power restores raggedly. Surge strips on fridge and freezer only, powering down smart devices whose inverters draw phantom loads. Rally family with preset whistle signals or air horns if phones drop. Assign stations, one fills water, one deploys lanterns on tables away from flammables. One grabs go bags to foyer, one tunes radio low volume for situational updates without panic spread. Secure cash and docks in chest poultice pouches around necks. Contact neighbors with practiced Knox-3 short pause. Too long sharing water allotments for elders. Pooling intel on road closures without rumor-mongering. Breathe deep, faith-anchored. Visualize ancestors who bartered through bank runs, hunkered through blizzards. This is stewardship, not surrender. This synthesis resolves the narrative's tension. Awareness transmutes fear into wisdom because the final 10 minutes test not just gear but character forged in years of quiet preparation. Echoing homesteader journals where families endured weeks without telegraph or rail by communal woodlots. Spring-fed cisterns, lye soap renders from ash and fat scraps. Government continuity plans like COG assume days for mutual aid staging, but individuals acting in those first minutes preserve order locally, preventing the looting waves seen in post-Katrina voids or Puerto Rico's Maria aftermath where unprepared enclaves collapsed while prepared. Thinkers thrived on rooftop solar and rainwater. True resilience honors America's lineage. From Minutemen mustering sand supply chains to World War II victory gardens yielding 40% of produce, proving decentralized responsibility outperforms centralized promises when systems strain. Start today. Audit your outlets weekly for flicker baselines. Stock one more water jug. Teach one neighbor one skill, because the grid's fragility mirrors our economies, both demanding stewardship over dependence. The lights may flicker tomorrow. Will you recognize the 10 minutes or join the dismissed masses? Your family's legacy turns on that choice, rooted in history's hard-won lessons.